They vandalize art. They occupy forests. They block streets. They stick their hands to the asphalt. They delay flights, block traffic, and sometimes perform impossible parkour. Who are these people, and why do they want your attention? They are climate protesters. First, let's get one thing right. What are they trying to achieve? They're trying to create awareness. They want policies that can actively tackle climate change. They talk about everything, from rising global temperatures to extreme weather events, from sea level rise to the loss of biodiversity. They want everything fixed. What do they demand? A reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, particularly carbon dioxide. A transition to renewable energy sources. Disinvesting fossil fuel industries. Climate justice. Equal distribution of the burdens of climate change. Protection of natural resources like forests and oceans. What kind of groups do they belong to? Some include Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, and the Sunrise Movement. Climate protesters have managed to gain international attention. The name and organization might differ, but the goal is the same: to call for meaningful action to combat climate change. Their intention may seem right, but how effective are their tactics? Climate protesters have dedicated themselves to raise awareness. They remind authorities again and again to do something about climate change. How do they do this? They'll shout. They'll create a ruckus. They'll damage public property. They'll ruin historic paintings just to make their point.
What is worth more, art or life?
They don't even fear arrest. You might think that this is gutsy. After all, the planet needs policies that can help it heal. And those policies are needed now. You would say climate protesters are taking one for the team. But are they really? Their radical and provocative activism is working against them. Climate protesters end up alienating allies. They face repression from authorities. Experts say that their tactics can be effective, but they have to strike a very delicate balance. It's perceived that if their action crosses a moral boundary, the game is over. The goal here is to get authorities to listen to you. How do you do that? By building direct pressure on them. Policymakers need strong incentives to change the status quo. If there's a backlash from voters, they'll probably listen. And how do you get voters on your side? By educating them about climate change and its impact. For that, climate protesters need a clear blueprint and far-sightedness. They need to reach the table where decisions are made. It's an uphill battle for sure. But will such extreme activism help in reaching long-term solutions to complicated problems? If that was possible, we would have achieved world peace a long time ago. Is it only climate protesters who require a perspective change? Probably not. When push comes to shove, countries and major companies will have to ramp up their climate action. they need to dismantle their profit-making mentality. They should welcome peaceful protests and create space for more social dialogue. Countries, specifically in Europe, are alarmed. They're cracking down on climate protesters. In France, lawmakers have passed new surveillance and detention laws. The country has used anti-terrorism units to question climate activists. Britain is going to make it illegal to glue yourself to property. In Berlin alone, there are over 4,500 incidents registered against the Last Generation and Extinction Rebellion groups. Police have spent hundreds of thousands of hours working on them. In May, police in several German states raided homes of 7 leaders of Last Generation. Bavaria is seeking to classify Last Generation as a criminal organization. It's being done under a law that allows widespread telephone surveillance.
We have seen in particularly the latter half of last year, 2022, so many protests which have impeded the rights of the law-abiding majority, those 10-mile tailbacks on the M25, those protests where people glued themselves to roads in London, taking a long time to remove. And in December, we saw protesters walking slowly down streets, deliberately trying to cause as much disruption as they possibly could. Not so much exercising a right of protest, but seeking to make a point by deliberately inconveniencing their fellow citizens. And that is not something which this government supports, and that is one of the reasons why we are now legislating.
But protesters are not backing down. 6 young protesters from Portugal are taking European countries to court. This is over inaction to tackle climate change. Protesters say they are outraged by the lack of action.
When your government literally issues licenses that they know are a death sentence for millions of people around the world, we have a duty as ordinary people to rise up in resistance against them. So we are planning a larger campaign than this country has ever seen before in order to make sure that these licenses are revoked.
Most climate activists welcome any action, as long as it benefits the environment. But when did radical steps become the answer to everything? Let's take you back a few decades. We all studied about the STATUS-QUO movement in school. It started in India in the 1970s. Its roots can be traced back to the 18th century. The STATUS-QUO movement was a non-violent agitation. STATUS-QUO means to stick. Villagers in the Uttarakhand region were alarmed by the continuous felling of trees. It impacted the ecological balance, so they decided to do something about it. People started hugging trees to prevent them from being cut. They wanted to protect and preserve trees. Women became a major part of this movement. It turned out to be a major success. India's then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi banned commercial felling of trees for 15 years. Today, the problem isn't limited to saving trees. It's more complicated than that. It's essentially about saving the world. Climate doomism can only take you so far. Climate optimism can also prove to be counterproductive. It's about time we realize that we're all in this together. And for real change to begin, climate protests must go beyond the shock value.
Amazônia livre de petróleo, Amazônia livre.